complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
Now, my guest today has not been on my show before. This is his first appearance, but he and I have actually known each other for quite a while. Charlemagne is one of the first guys I met face to face from our thing, and so I'm quite happy to have him on my show. But before we get into that, a brief word from Axios. All right, Charlemagne, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Wow, I'm in the mood to get swole now after watching that.
I know that was the work of Dimes of Blood Satellite, and we sent him some inspiration for it, and he sent that back. We're like, "Yep, good, send it. It's completely perfect." So yeah, I like that ad a lot.
Yeah, I recall meeting you in Louisiana at Bagby's house, right? And I actually recall right before I met you, I was listening to your podcast. I think it was one of your first episodes, and it was the one you had done with Thomas77, and you got into topics I had not heard him discuss before, some religious ones, if I recall, and that was really interesting. I think that was one of the first times like Thomas started coming onto the scene, you know, in his sort of big comeback in contemporary times, like after, you know, Ace had interviewed him and stuff. So that was really cool. I have fond memories of that day, to be honest, because it was, you know, shortly before I moved.
Yeah, it's funny. And not to turn this into a discussion about me, but I recently got a compliment from Stephen Carson Radlib, basically saying that, oh, you know, Thomas's episodes on Jay's show are always interesting. You know, you see a different side of him. And honestly, I think part of it is just that Thomas and I, despite looking very different, have a relatively similar personality. You know, we get along pretty well. And so there's just a kind of chemistry there. And it's why I enjoy talking to him about things that aren't necessarily, you know, the same type of historical series you see him do on someone's like Pete's show, right? Like those are great shows. But it's like, why would I do something else that someone else is already doing? You know, why would I produce a derivative content? And yeah, I really enjoy doing them. Obviously, you know, Thomas and I are good friends, and I think it's a fun dynamic. Yeah, it's interesting too, because not only have you and I met before, but we've actually spent quite a lot of time together. You know, we've had multiple IRL events where we've both been in attendance. So it is kind of odd that you and I have never really spoken on air before.
Yeah, well, I recall when you had first started your show, you tried to get in touch with me, and I think you had emailed me. And I'm just really bad about checking my email, so I just never noticed. So we just kind of never ended up having a show. But yeah, I think it's time we actually, you know, had a podcast together.
Well, definitely, man. So you've been around for quite a while as far as internet time goes, and I actually watched a lot of your videos before I produced anything of my own. So how did you get to posting on the internet, and what are you doing now?
Yeah, how did I get posting on the internet? Well, you know, as a millennial, when YouTube first came out, I sort of made a YouTube channel, as many other people did, and, you know, sometimes put some personal stuff on there, but mostly just use the account to, you know, have a favorites list and all that. Sometimes around 2014, just started uploading some gaming videos to my channel because, you know, I was into the whole Let's Play thing kind of before Twitch became big, and I was like, oh, I play lots of video games, right? I'll just upload me playing video games and see what happens. And then around 2014, the whole Gamergate culture wars thing started kicking off, and, you know, I followed Medicur and Sargon and a lot of these people, and I was like, well, you know, I've got like 500 subs, you know, just putting up me playing Star Wars real-time strategy games, basically. So I don't know, let me just try doing some political videos because it seems important to, you know, try and move the needle. You know, I sort of felt this obligation, you know, living in a democracy to try and do something. So that was pretty much how I got involved. It just felt like something I ought to at least try to contribute to, and, I had some skill at that point doing like basic editing and stuff. So it just seemed like the right thing to do. And then, I made some just sort of I just made various types of, I guess, like classical liberal type videos, I guess. Mostly just talking about some current events. Sometimes I would analyze this or that news story or court case. Eventually, someone in Discord server I was in um, had mentioned like Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin, or Moldbug as he was known then, enough to me that I started looking into it. And then once I read the open letter to open-minded progressives, my mind was blown, and I, really wanted to make video content on this. And that's sort of what my channel became known for. And that's really like the core of my content today, that introduced a lot of people to this type of thinking, and including even, Aaron McIntyre got into all this stuff because he watched my channel as well. So I'm very satisfied with, what I've done. In terms of my content, even though I don't really make a whole lot of video content on my channel anymore, I think I do feel like I've contributed something of value to my nation, which is really all I ever really wanted to do. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts of my channel. Eventually, I got past the whole like Yarvin, the reactionary stuff. I could spend a bunch of time sort of going back and critiquing all of his stuff, but I feel like that has worked its way into the zeitgeist enough at this point that I don't really feel the need to do that. And I don't like punching right anyway. And then, of course, the sort of topic you want to get into is, recently I've been doing streams every now and then on the war in the Ukraine, which I, became very interested in as soon as it kicked off, as happened with many people. And then, others, aren't so interested in it, understandably, which is, why I make content on it and talk about it.
So the real hard-hitting question I wanted to bring up while you're on my show is, you're playing Axis and Allies. What's your turn one Germany strategy?
Yeah, I forgot to even mention, ironically, the most popular video on my channel is this random series of videos for Axis and Allies strategy. That's kind of a meme, isn't it? But
Well, and the funny part for those who aren't familiar is, if you are subscribed to Charlemagne on YouTube, which I recommend, roughly every 2 weeks that video will get recommended to you, almost no matter what. So it's become a kind of a running joke among us and our friends.
It was funny. I was watching some Axis and Allies content recently because I brought the game to the Old Glory Club meetup, the private one, not the event, and taught some of the guys how to play the game. And I was sort of refreshing myself on like the rules, and I found a tournament setup that's more balanced. And anyway, one of the channels I watched just randomly name dropped me, even though I hadn't made videos in years. I was kind of tickled by that just this random board gaming channel like still mentioned my channel as one of the like Axis and Allies YouTube creators, which, I don't know, it was just really hilarious. I was just I was like, laying in my bed, getting ready to go to bed, just kind of watching some podcasts as you do, and then like I hear my own channel get dropped in this random video, and I was like, wait, what? But anyway.
So obviously that was more of a joke, but back to the kind of the issue at hand, which is the war in Ukraine. So before we went live, you mentioned something that was kind of I think, an eloquent way to put it, which is effectively the situation as it is now is that effectively everyone realizes Ukraine is going to lose. And that was a sharp departure from how it was even relatively recently, where at least the propaganda from the global American empire was, not only is Ukraine winning, but Ukraine is winning handily. So when we say that everyone knows Ukraine is going to lose, how much of that is explicit versus implicit? Are people saying that, in regime sources, or is it just kind of a quiet understanding?
It's not so quiet anymore. If you read the regime forces, they're all acknowledging that Ukraine is on the back foot and losing territory, and that the United States needs to, start shipping at the F-16s and everything else we have left in the inventory, or else things are going to go badly. They're basically admitting that Ukraine is on the path to losing unless something drastic is done in terms of how many weapons we're shipping to them, what type of weapons, Patriot missile defense systems and all of this stuff, and then the Europeans as well. And there's also talk of there's always been this low level concept of maybe committing some sort of NATO troops to the country. So it's pretty open at this point in mainstream sources, even that they can't do anything but acknowledge that Ukraine is losing, especially after the counteroffensive failed about 9 months ago or so. That was really their last hope. And then, of course, the Russians have taken back almost all that territory now. So even total regime shills can't really cover things up anymore.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. I've spoken with both Marcus, Furious Pertinax, and then also Argent about this, which is, look, like I'm not a geopolitics guy, right? That's not my circuit. I watch guys who kind of digest it for me, and I'd sort of gotten lulled to sleep by the Russia-Ukraine war. Nothing out of the ordinary was happening, but the whole that giant media trailer produced for the Ukrainian offensive. First it was the spring, then the summer, then whatever it became. It's such a bizarre occurrence, to announce to the entire world exactly what your plan is. I mean, it is just interesting to see how much of this war seems to be kind of run for the sake of making people in the State Department feel nice about themselves. It's just it is very odd to me.
Yeah, even when you look at some of the material, the best material arguments for the war, like, we're weakening the Russian Federation, and, these State Department officials are getting off to how many Russian tanks they're blowing up. And, we're doing all this damage to their military or whatever. And when you really think about this, it's like, what is actually the value in destroying, say, 5,000 Russian tanks, right? 5,000 T-55, 64, T-64, 72s, whatever. It's like, okay, let's say it's a given that we actually have destroyed this many tanks. What does that actually mean unless following the Ukraine war, if you're not going to launch like an immediate offensive against the Russian Federation, like what does destroying their tanks actually do if you're not actually planning to invade Russia? Because the way I see it, they're just going to build more tanks. That'll cost them some money, sure, but so what? I mean, great powers like Russia and the United States can spend some extra on their military budget, not just totally collapse or something. So it's like, unless you're actually planning on some great campaign against Russia itself, just sort of, doing this like chip damage to their military, it doesn't really accomplish anything other than, like you said, State Department officials like Blinken, who, as we know, is a Jew whose grandparents fled the pogroms in Russia. People like that just get off to it.
Yeah, I think that's something that has been, and maybe it's just that this was always going on, with the sort of neocon wars, and it was just further away. Like we weren't getting the same type of digital information, from Iraq and Afghanistan, right? There just wasn't. There was a language barrier. There was a huge cultural barrier, which obviously there exists with Russia. But let's be honest, Russia is a more sophisticated, state when it comes to media than Afghanistan is, right? So, sorry to say it. So maybe that's always been the case. But I think it's been, to me, kind of interesting to watch characters like, Victoria Nuland, the people currently involved in this now that she's technically stepped down, just how petty those people are. That there really isn't, at least as far as I can make out, some kind of grand strategy. Guys sitting in a smoke-filled room smoking pipes. Like, these just seem to be people who are not particularly intelligent, at least from my perspective.
Well, yeah, and if you actually think about the consequences of this war and from a grand strategy perspective, and I guarantee you all of the military people who listen to the show are going to agree with this take, is all we've actually done is spend probably eventually 3 years, if not 4 or 5. All we've done is give the Russians, 2 years and change of real experience fighting a fifth generation war against a near peer power. And that sort of experience at a strategic and operational and tactical level is invaluable compared to any amount of training or the 5,000 or so tanks that have been destroyed. Right? There's almost nothing more valuable than getting the opportunity in effectively a completely safe setting, right? Because the war isn't on Russia itself; it's contained in this region in Ukraine. Russia just gets to have 2 or more years of just live combat trials experience in fifth gen war with all of the drones and all of the electronic warfare and everything else we've seen. And NATO and the United States, we're not getting that experience, right? Our guys are not getting that experience. There are a few NATO officers and a few mercs on the ground, right? But the military that's getting the experience is the AFU, and they're getting wiped out. So none of the experience in this war is actually going to translate to our military. So our military is not going to have the experience in fighting a fifth gen war, and then Russia is. So even from a grand strategy, from any perspective, there's no way to really look at this and be like, oh yeah, this is serving the interests of the United States. Okay, so let's say 100,000 Russians have died. In terms of grand strategy, that's worth it for the Russian Federation to know how to fight a near peer competitor in a modern war. You can have all the theory crafting you want in like Western sources, but at the end of the day, it's the actual on the ground experience that matters.
Well, and I realize this is terrible podcasting referencing an episode that hasn't come out yet, but I have a recorded episode with Clay Martin, who is at a secret squirrel unit with the Marines, then with the Green Berets for quite a while, and now is one of us, kind of writes novels in addition to other things. But he was talking about one of the continual delusions of the American military, right, going back to kind of World War II and Vietnam, which is effectively the idea that firepower and kind of like whiz bang technology will save the day. And this is something we have seen continually over and over again with the Russia-Ukraine war, right? It is painting Russia as this kind of like, comedically inept force of morons, right? They call them orcs. We hear about things like the cope cages, which don't work. Nothing that they do works. They have nothing that can counteract, insert your favorite technology, right, that the NAFO types are going off about. But I think what we've seen is not only is that clearly not the case, right? Seems like the cope cages have actually proved to be quite effective at their main goal, right, which is drone dropped munitions. Russia has been innovating when it comes to kind of like cyber warfare, when it comes to blocking out drones with electronic countermeasures, which admittedly I'm not smart enough to understand, but people assure me they do work. And all of the kind of incredibly expensive technology that the West has dumped in Ukraine, it has worked in the sense that the bombs go off when they say they will, but that does not a war win. And yet again, it seems like America is learning the lesson that just because you have better stuff doesn't mean you'll win the engagement or the war, taken in total. Do you see what I'm getting at there, Charlemagne?
Yeah, well, I was listening to this podcast a couple of, I don't know, a week or two ago that Pete Kianyas did with some fellow on the war in Chechnya. And, he talked about the problems in the Russian army back then and how it was basically still this corrupt Soviet system. And they couldn't, their commanding officers were like stealing food and selling it. So they basically had to like loot their own food from the territory and things like this. And everyone was getting drunk. And, frankly, that's what the Ukrainian army looks like more than the Soviets, right? The Ukrainians also were a Soviet state, and the Russians are no longer like this, right? In the last 20 years or so, they've developed into a perfectly modern, basically normal country. It's not this like Soviet corrupt bureaucracy anymore that doesn't function at this sort of basic level. They've handled all those problems, and for some reason people in the West, and yeah, you see this all the time, this like weird delusion that Russians are just a bunch of drunks and orcs, and the corruption is just totally off the chart. I always laugh at this because it's like, are you saying like our country is any less corrupt than Russia? I mean, come on. You look at Russia at this point, and I don't really see any reason to believe that we actually are less corrupt. I mean, Russia it's more open, right? The corruption in Russia is kind of more open, but people do get punished for it, right? One of Russia's, I forget which general, but one of their top generals was just fired on corruption charges. I mean, you could basically say that, I don't know, Putin is just has some sort of personal vendetta against him, and it's not corruption. I don't know, but at the very least, people are ostensibly punished for corruption, right? That doesn't really happen in the U.S. But in any case, yes, the Russian army is a modern army, and it functions It functions, just like you would expect any first world army to function. They are not these just incompetent idiots. And even if they were 2 years into the war, they're certainly not that anymore, right? And if anything, the Ukrainians also were that because you know, the war was basically just like two post-Soviet armies fighting each other when it first started out. So anything you could level at the Russians, obviously you would also level that at the Ukrainians, right? So it doesn't make any sense to really claim that Russia's going to lose because of this reason when their opponent is basically the same country, right?
Well, I think that brings up another interesting development about this, right? Which is effectively the massive amount of projection we see going on with kind of the neocon establishment in Ukraine, right? That effectively every negative thing they say about Russia is at the very least equally apparent in their favorite state of Ukraine. And I think that's why this has been kind of interesting to me as someone who doesn't really follow the military stuff. It's just the evolution of the kind of like core narrative, right? Is that, and look, like I don't have the kind of like visceral hand wringing reaction to symbols associated with mid-century Germany that some people do. But at the same time, we have to at least acknowledge the jarring clash between, sorry, I said Israel and I meant Ukraine. Maybe that was a more accurate term. But point is, right, between Ukraine being this bastion of liberal democracy where you can get gay married, and also every single time there's a military parade, half the guys are wearing SS runes, right? Like that's just weird. You have to admit that. And to see our ruling class kind of tie themselves in knots trying to justify this, at the very least, that's notable. So how much do you think that kind of narrative about Ukraine is just complete and total cope? Like it is just, I want Ukraine to win the war, so I will say the things needed. And how much of it is, do you think, a genuine ideological commitment?
On whose part?
Sorry, on the U.S. government and by extension the Ukrainian government, right? That are kind of puppets in the region.
I mean, I think the U.S. government genuinely thought they were going to win this war. On the Ukrainian side, it's hard for me to say because I can't read Ukrainian sources, and any information coming out of the country is filtered through Western sources, and I don't think Zelensky's really a if you listen to him, I don't think he's like a proxy for what the average Ukrainian actually thinks. I think I think most militaries believe in their own victory. I do get the sense from the interviews I have seen with some Ukrainian soldiers that on the ground reporters have done. They do seem to believe that they actually could win the war. I think that might mostly be premised on the West actually providing the necessary support. But I also get the sense that your day-to-day soldiers don't really think about this too much. Understandably, they're just thinking about the tactical situations they're in. Their mind is not on like this grand strategy level. They're trusting in their commanding officers and their leadership that this war is being fought on the basis that the war will be won. Otherwise, why would you fight the war? I expect that view is probably fading, but it's very hard to grasp. But it does seem to me like the U.S. and the Ukrainians did actually believe that they could win the war, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's interesting to me watching this, I've been mentioning on the show more and more that I will occasionally watch Judge Napolitano's show. And, he and his friends tend to be vaguely right wing, vaguely, in some cases, very explicitly connected to U.S. intelligence, and extremely skeptical on Ukraine and anti-Israel. So that's kind of his position generally. And one of the things that his guests continually talk about is the fact that France in particular has had more and more of an involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war. We keep hearing rumors that the French Foreign Legion will be sent in. We hear, estimates that there could be, well over 1,000. Some of the estimates are so much higher, I consider it ridiculous. people, French soldiers, not foreign legion, involved in fighting. I realize it's hard to tell because so much of what you hear on this war is complete rumor and hearsay. But to what degree are other nations like France, for example, involved in this war? And do you think that they will, send in troops to reinforce the Ukrainians?
Yeah, the situation with France is pretty interesting. I think the whole Foreign Legion story was kind of a fabrication, if I recall. There are a lot of Western mercenaries in the Ukraine. It's really difficult to tell exactly how many. It's probably in the hundreds or thousands at most. And that's fine from geopolitical purposes. That doesn't really condemn any of the other powers to some sort of conflict with Russia anymore. Certainly less than it does the fact that the West has been sending all their weapons to Ukraine. But in any case, so the Europeans are pissed off, right? That basically the Americans tricked them into dumping their military arsenal into the Ukraine while the U.S. is reneging on their commitments. Obviously, this serves the State Department's interests because it basically keeps Europe entirely dependent on the NATO Western alliance for their own defense. Because America basically just got them to send all of their stuff. Not all of it. I'm exaggerating a bit, but a substantial amount of their military technology to the Ukraine on the premise that the U.S. was going to follow suit. And then we just kind of didn't, right? We just sort of dangled F-16s and the Abrams and all this in front of them, forever, and they never actually materialized. So the Europeans are getting pissed off. France in particular, as I mentioned in chat, I'm researching the Suez Crisis, 1956 right now, because I became interested in Macron and France itself, because of the sort of leadership position he seems to be trying to take. I know Macron is not particularly popular among our circles, for pretty obvious reasons, and fair enough. But I'm just kind of interested in as objectively I can analyzing, what he's actually doing. And basically, ever since 1956, France sort of realized that it couldn't count on its ostensible allies, Great Britain. And the United States, and that they wanted to pursue a more European-focused policy. And this is sort of, the Treaty of Rome, or Treaties of Rome, for example, establishing the European Economic Zone, were signed like right after the Suez Crisis, and France was sort of a leading member of that. So France sort of, the German president at the time even said that, this will be your revenge, basically. Like, Europe is France's revenge against its British and American quote unquote allies, because, okay, now France is going to lead this new power bloc. And basically, France has been trying to take a leadership position in Europe ever since then. I think Macron sees that there is an opportunity to now, since the U.S. is very obviously reneging on the level of rhetoric it had committed itself to. The French are saying, okay, well, look, we can step up to the plate here and become the leaders in the European military alliance that the Americans are refusing to be. And actually, okay, you're not going to commit stuff. We're going to commit now. We are going to commit to Ukraine. We're going to double down and basically show the Americans that actually Europeans can make the military commitments against Russia or whoever that they promise. So I think this might be what Macron and France are trying to do right now. And ultimately we will see if any foreign legion does get committed to Ukraine or not, or any French or other NATO troops. And one important thing to understand here is, this has annoyed me to no end, is during the whole war, people are always like, oh, Article 5, it's World War III. It's like, just go to NATO's website right now and read Articles 5 and 6. Article 5 has actually been invoked in the past, which is the, mutual defense article. It was actually invoked by the Americans after 9/11. So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because the Americans are the only country to ever invoke Article 5 for collective defense. And the Europeans stepped up to the plate or some of them did, when the Americans invoked Article 5 for mutual defense. Notably, Tony Blair did so. Now, the Europeans are in a situation where, they're interested in collective defense, vis-a-vis Ukraine. And the Americans, despite the Europeans committing themselves to collective defense after 9/11, the Americans aren't doing it now. So they have, ample reason to be upset in that capacity. But in any case, the point here is that Articles 5 and 6 aren't like World War III triggers. All the articles say is that the NATO partners will come together under the circumstances in which they are attacked on their own territories, or certain sea territories. You can read Article 6 to see what the specified regions of the world are. If they are attacked, the nations will come together and they will all individually make decisions on what they will commit to collective defense. There's no automatic entry into a global world war. In any case, France could send its regular army to Ukraine, and that would not necessarily trigger some sort of global war. So there's ample reason to believe that the Europeans, and France in particular, could increase their commitments to the war, even including troops. And this would be, perfectly fine in terms of not precipitating a global conflict with Russia or some sort of nuclear war. So I think that's important for people to understand that there's people act like there's some sort of brick wall that is NATO that like prevents any direct engagement between any NATO country and Russia in the Ukraine. The Ukraine is not covered by Article 6, because only NATO territories are. So France and Russia can duke it out in Ukraine, so long as Russia does not attack the territory of France itself. They can duke it out, and there's no Article 5, no World War III, unless one of those powers wants to escalate, right?
This has actually been something that I was kind of surprised by. It seems like Putin has been remarkably restrained in this war, generally speaking, right? I mean, and again, it's hard because so much of the kind of what we consider far right spaces is full of just out and out Russia shills, right? Pick your favorite one. But nonetheless, it does seem like there was a lot of predictive programming of basically, expecting Russia to escalate and escalate and escalate. And I mean, it seems like Putin is wanting to keep this as localized as he possibly can.
Yeah, and you kind of see that as well with the whole like Kharkov front that's opened up. One of the interesting things about the war is the Russians retreated around Kiev and Kharkov and Sumy after the first few weeks of the war. And then it's like there's an invisible wall between Ukraine and Russia, right? Like Ukraine and Russia have a massive border, but there's a sort of mutual agreement that, we're just going to fight in the territory of Ukraine. Some of that is because the Western countries have said, look, you can't use these weapons we're giving you on the territory of Russia. But it's really interesting that, both sides have agreed to this. And, the Russians have until now, with this new front, they've sort of respected this sort of virtualized space in which the combat is confined to, and not tried to perform some sort of other attacks on other parts of the country. So it's because there's no reason why the war shouldn't spill over into Russia itself, but it hasn't, and both sides have a vested interest in keeping it contained, obviously. And so yeah, I mean, Putin's not a madman, right? Like he's not gonna. He has no incentive whatsoever to engage in some sort of nuclear war or attack the Westerners. The Russians are clearly winning in Ukraine. The Western countries can keep dumping all the military technology they want into the Ukraine, and clearly that's not enough. So why would he escalate the war? You have to understand too that the Russians didn't actually expect this to happen. They've been, if you read their geopoliticians, you can understand that they've basically been economically preparing for this for almost a decade, and the war sort of preempted their timeline, and their economic model was sort of premised on the fact that the conflict would remain frozen basically perpetually. So it's a big problem for the Russian Federation that this conflict actually opened up like it did. But they had sufficiently prepared for that eventuality to the extent that it didn't destroy their economy. So they certainly don't want the war to escalate any further than it needs to, because they were not completely prepared for it, and did not want it to happen. They really wanted a negotiated end to it, or at least for it to remain frozen forever. Because the fact is, what this conflict effectively does is it puts Russia in the junior position in the Asiatic economic system that's developing between China and Russia. Russia was really aiming to be the senior partner in the Russia-China partnership, and this war is pushing it in favor of China because they're not having to deal with the economic limitations and spending that's now required by the war. So, if anything, the war is ultimately just helping China, which definitely plays into theses that many other people have put forward, including like Semiagog about where the allegiance of the American government truly lies.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because oftentimes, and I feel like these issues can be difficult to talk about because it's hard to get unbiased information. But BRICS is oftentimes portrayed as this kind of like unified block, right, of people who don't like America, and in the kind of tried and true tradition of the axis of evil, right, whereby American neocon interests like painting anyone they don't like as grouped together in some kind of like supervillain cabal. Oftentimes Russia and China get lumped together as sort of one thing. But you brought up something very interesting, right? That this war has sort of shifted the balance between the two. Because Russia obviously not only has to fight a war, but has been hit by economic sanctions, whereas China has not. And so obviously that's shifted the balance. So how much have these economic sanctions worked to harm Russia? And then how have they shifted the perception of the power of US sanctions as a tool for other nations as well?
Well, it hasn't really done much to the Russian economy itself. What it has done is strangled Russia's European partnerships, which is what they are really counting on to grow their economic uh, model that they're envisioning, like basically the whole world adopting. Right? Is this I don't know. Maybe you want to call it. They use various different terms. Like some people use sort of like socialism or a sort of social conservatism. I forget the exact terminology some of them use, but in any case, they view as sort of like a mixed like market economy with a lot of like social welfare programs and stuff built in, and they want to partner with the Europeans basically in order to have that as an economic zone in which they can do business, increase their geopolitical power, increase their influence and the amount of money the Russians have available, especially with in trading in their liquid natural gas and other natural resources. They want to develop this into a sort of high technology economy, right? Because Russia doesn't want to be a glorified gas station because that's not a viable position to be in. Because you need to develop high technology inside your own country in order to be a leader in the modern world. So what the Americans have done basically is cut Europe off from the Russians, which necessarily leads them to having to depend more on China than the Europeans. And the problem is, if you're depending on China for the type of critical partnerships you need, you can't exactly be like a leader in that field, right? So the issue is Russia's economy hasn't really been harmed so much as their grand strategy has been harmed, and China's grand strategy has been helped. And of course, Europe's also been harmed by this because one of the major foreign policy of the United States is to keep Europe and notably Germany from partnering with Russia and becoming independent of the U.S. Europe at this point, given the way the war has gone, is basically going to be perpetually dependent on the U.S. unless France or some other power can figure a way to regain their sort of economic independence. But that's really premised on some sort of partnership with Russia, as far as I can tell. So I'm not sure how they can get out of this. So I mean that what the Americans have done is just have basically probably doomed half the world's population to being in a junior position to China for the next century in terms of their economic model.
So one of the recurring conversations you hear on our side of things is that the DR doesn't exist. And the argument basically goes, well, you have a group of people who have almost nothing in common past being in a conversation together. And I think one of the points that is often cited is the Russia-Ukraine war. Because, for someone like you and I, Charlemagne, who live relatively close, speaking in geographic terms, to the center of the empire, right? It would take massive, massive losses from the US empire for our areas of the country to ever not be under control by USG. We might have an interest in, basically the US government being thwarted abroad. Whereas, for instance, our European allies might look at, particularly the Nordic types, might look at, a rising Russia with, a lot of trepidation. So, one, do you see that split between different factions of the DR? Are those people kind of looking at their own genuine interest, or they've been kind of blinded by ideology? And then also, what would you say is, the position that kind of our guys, right, whether they be from America or elsewhere, should take on this conflict?
Well, yes. I mean, I've rejected the whole concept of the dissident right from the very beginning, but the term took off for better or worse, and it's just sort of this, after the alt-right collapsed, which was sort of a real coherent thing, people sort of needed some sort of new word to describe the right with that clearly wasn't the conservative right, and dissident right sort of came about. But in my view, it's never really been anything but this sort of catch-all term to describe pretty much anyone who's sort of outside the mainstream and never really represented a coherent group. I was really bothered, I don't know, a year or two ago when I started seeing the abbreviation DR in capital letters, as if this was some formal entity with which it's not. I mean, in my view, only things that are actually formally constructed actually exist. These sort of like phantom concepts like the dissident right, it really does nothing more than describe a general group of people of many different persuasions, and it is really nothing more than that. Even talking about factions within it doesn't really make sense to me, because there is no it to be within. It really never existed. People are like proclaiming the death of it now, but it's like something can't die if it didn't exist in the first place. Anyway, I think the position I take on the war from studying the conflict, I admittedly really knew nothing about what was going on in Ukraine before the war kicked off, and then I immediately, went and researched it because, well, it seemed important. And what I came to realize is, like, basically, it's a war between, two effectively white Christian countries, and you can be like, oh, like Slavs aren't white or whatever. I mean, it's pretty obvious that at least European Russians are white. If you want to take this weird uber racialist take, it's like, okay, whatever, man. But they're white Christians on both sides for the most part, right? And this is a huge problem because you basically have a war funded by anti-Christian factions in the U.S. government, Zionists, Jews like Anthony Blinken, for example, who may in fact be the real president for all we can tell. They're perpetuating this war between two Christian countries, and it's wiping out literally hundreds of thousands of white Christian men. This is obviously just not good. No one should, you know, we shouldn't want this to happen really anywhere. But for us Europeans or Americans in particular, the last thing we need right now is this sort of civil war between two Christian countries, destroying each other by the hundreds of thousands. So number one, your position would be, well, this conflict needs to end, right? This shouldn't be happening. We need to figure out how to end this conflict so that we stop killing each other. I understand Russia's a different civilization, right? But they're also a Christian civilization. And yes, they're a multi-ethnic empire, but there are also a great many whites in the Russian Empire. And we should not want these people all killing each other. It doesn't make any sense in terms of the position that the tenuous position the white peoples of Europe currently occupy in Europe. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of the territories under contention themselves, since 2014, basically the Ukrainian government, and to be fair, the Russian side, if you want to call it that, did fire back. But basically, the Ukrainians have been just bombing randomly the territories of the Donbass and Donetsk for 8 years until the war broke out. The way I look at sort of international relations is all the countries of the world live in a state of anarchy between themselves, and you basically own what you can control, right? That's how you have title to some sort of land. And the Donetsk and Lugansk both, basically seceded from Ukraine, right? And after 8 years, the Ukrainian government could not regain control of these places. And it's like, look, at some point, uh, you can't just randomly bomb civilians for 8 years. That has to end. If you can't take this territory back, then you can't just sit there and bomb civilians for 8 years. The Russians, understandably went in to put a stop to this. And it's like people argue, oh, well, now hundreds of thousands of people are getting killed. I watched this Gay Epsler Perun talk about how, well, before the war, only a few tens of people or hundreds, died per year, and now tens of thousands of dying. Well, it's like, okay, it's like, so the people in the Donbass and the Russians are supposed to just put up with like random artillery strikes in the city because if you do anything about it, more people will die. I mean, this is just utterly stupid to think this way. Obviously, more people die in a full scale war, but again, you can bake this down to like a tribal level. Like if you're in your neighborhood, like if the neighboring neighborhood to yours just like once a year just randomly bombed a house, and you're like, well, if we did anything about it, more people would die. I mean, that's the type of thinking exhibited here. So in my view, it's like there's a clear moral right and wrong dividing this war, and it's clear that the Ukrainian government, the Zelensky regime, is in the moral wrong here because they're the faction that has been assaulting the civilian population completely randomly and still do it to this day. They've been doing it for you know uh, about 10 years now, right? And that just can't be tolerated by any sensible person. So that's the way I view the war. I don't really have any like pro-Russian sensibilities at all. My only real position on the war is like the Zelensky regime needs to be destroyed. I don't really care who does it. It would have been better if the Americans had done it before the war even started. But obviously NATO and the Americans were insistent on provoking the war, and they did it. So I would like to see an end to the war, and the war cannot end so long as the current government in Ukraine stands. So be it the Russians or whoever puts an end to the situation, that's what I think is the morally correct view from a Christian perspective take on the war. The war needs to be ended. Uh, I don't see any way to condemn the Russian state for coming to the aid of these two sort of proto states that existed for the past 8 years that were being bombed by another government. And obviously, many of the people in here were ethnic Russians. How could any state or ethnicity be expected to tolerate that? And how can you declare anyone evil and immoral for resisting it? So I think that's the correct perspective to have on the war.
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable take. Recently I had a stream going through the post of Project Liberal, right? Something you and I have done together before. And it's always interesting to me how a certain stripe of liberal, and I mean that in big L sense, right? Not merely as a pejorative, although probably also as an insult, but views war through this incredibly simplistic model of basically who swung the first shot, right? Like who made the first move. But it's very narrowly defined, right? Because as many have said, this war with Russia and Ukraine has gone on for what, 10 years? Really, in kind of a very minor sense. And then so it's like, well, okay, like who started the war? Really? Like, okay, Wikipedia says Russia did, but I mean, Ukraine has shot a lot of shells at Russia, so breaking it down to that kind of simple, moralistic standard of, whose boot crossed the line first is kind of stupid. And I think that's why I find your coverage on this very refreshing, because there's so much moral cant. There's so much just kind of shrieking hysterics about it. Whereas, I think the most reasonable take is effectively like, look, like this needs to end. This going on forever is monstrous, right? It's a complete and total waste. And especially when, almost anyone who wasn't clouded by ideology looked at this at the very beginning and said, you know what? I'll be honest, Russia probably has this just by virtue of being Russia and Ukraine being Ukraine. And the idea that, we did something noble because we enabled the destruction of the entire Ukrainian male population, to me, it's just monstrous. Like, it would have been so much better for everyone involved if Ukraine could have just given up, whatever oblasts they will end up losing, and kept their population, kept whatever they were. And now that's a country that's dead. And so I really have no patience whatsoever for the moral grandstanding of the people involved in this conflict.
No, and this weird obsession with the morality of where the lines are on the map is what drives this. Like, it's just somehow wrong for lines on the map to ever change, unless liberal elites want it, I guess. It's like, again, if Ukraine had just managed to crush the rebels and retake the territory in 2014, fair enough. Like, I legitimately don't care who controls which parts of Ukraine. I just think that America especially shouldn't be funding the war. That's really the issue, is we're behind this, right? The American government and the European governments are behind this conflict. So it's on us to some extent to do whatever we can. As I originally lended my voice when I explained, why I created my channel in the first place, it's on us to some extent to try and explain to people, like, look, this is just this war is just wiping out hundreds of thousands of white Christians, and we're funding it, and it needs to stop. And in terms of the moral dimensions, I think Thomas has made this point, this whole like playground stuff where it's like, oh, well, who punched first? I mean, look, we're talking about international relations and grand strategy here. Like, this sort of childish nonsense just has no place in it. It doesn't matter who struck first. It matters who can control the territory. Okay, Ukraine could not control this territory. And no right-thinking person can see Ukraine as being or the Ukrainian government, I should say, as being in like the moral good after their military, bombed the Donbass for 8 years. I mean, look, 10,000 people died from the years 2014 to 2022, and of course that's including both sides. The Russian side, the separatists, right? They weren't actual Russian regulars. It was they're militias for the most part. They fired back and also killed people, but the vast majority of the strikes were conducted from the Ukrainian side on civilian population centers. This is done from the OSCE mission, I believe it was called. All this is well documented by international observer bodies. So you can't really make this claim that like Ukraine is just strictly in the moral good here. It's when we're talking about war and peace, I mean, things get gray very quickly, and it really just comes down to what's going to restore the peace, right? Like, I'm not anti-war in a general sense. We don't want war to just go on forever, but we understand that wars sometimes happen. But when they do happen, the immediate concern is, well, how do we end this in a way that's going to be satisfactory to restoring the peace? I mean, that is what that is one end war must accomplish, is that at some point peace has to return. There can't just be perpetual war. And the status quo that the Americans were apparently happy with from 2014 to 2022 and then to now is just perpetual war. How is that in any way like a morally acceptable Christian position? It's just not.
Well, and it's actually the same reason that I've recently become much more interested in Israel-Palestine, is that, look, like, if I were designing, a foreign policy for America from scratch, Israel would feature in it to no degree whatsoever, right? But I don't get to make that choice. And I live in a nation where, the government has an almost fanatical support for the nation of Israel. And so, even if I don't particularly on an emotional level care literally at all about Palestinians, right? In the same way that I don't care about like the Sudanese, or what goes on in Madagascar, it has become my problem because of the government that I live in. And again, right, we're seeing this over and over again, that, these problems have been sort of, they become our problem more and more, right? As we've kind of invited these people into our country. Maybe not super relevant, but just something to consider for the latent isolationists in the audience. But Charlemagne, we're fast approaching the end of our time together. If people want to find you, what's a good way for them to do so?
Well, as you mentioned, I do have a channel. It's just called Charlemagne. Probably the best way to find it is to search for Axis and Allies videos. But you could find it if you look for, my Moldbug or Ukraine live streams or whatever. And then I do more work lately on my Substack. I'm working on my 40th book review now, or I guess it's 41st because I started at number 0. I'm doing a book review on, like I said, the Suez Crisis. That's paid content. I mostly do paid content on the Substack now, which is charlemagne.substack.com. And, I have a number of book reviews there, and I also sort of give my thoughts on the content and relate it to, our modern situation as well. If you're interested in this topic, I have a number of reviews on various books on the Ukrainian war from people like, Pavel Gubarev, who was sort of one of the original separatists in Donbass and was even governor in Donetsk. I have a couple of books that I've reviewed from Russian geopoliticians. So yeah, check that out if you're interested. And, there's free previews for all the content as well if you're not a paid subscriber, so you can sort of see if you're into it at this point. Like I said, there's 40 book reviews you can preview if you want to see if it's worth paying for the whole thing. And yeah, a lot. One last thing, funnily enough, a lot of my book reviews are just like, I got into the habit of just writing down every single book Thomas ever mentioned on anyone's stream and just kind of just bought all of them and then subsequently reviewed them. So yeah, feel free to check that out.
Well, actually, I have a similar document of just Thomas book recommendations, some of them from private conversations. So I may send you the screenshot of that, because I found that to be an excellent way to get reading material, is to read something Thomas has recommended.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, guys, if you're looking for more of my work, you can find The Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a Substack. It has been exactly 1 month since I have published an article, so I should probably do another one sometime. Who knows if that'll happen? I would also highly recommend you guys come to the OGC event. There are just a few tickets left, and both Charlie and I will be there. And if you want to support us, best way to do that is to head over to Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching and fill out the survey there. JD he's one of us. He's a good guy, and he helps support the channel. And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.